Hi everyone, I'm Michelle.
Hi, I'm Tara. Welcome back to our podcast Books and Beyond with Bound, Season 4.
Where we talk to some of the finest writers in India to find out what makes them tick.
So as you guys know, both of us, we are editors, we're podcasters, we're storytellers, and through Bound, we really want to help you create stories and put them out into the world. So let's begin the episode.
And we just received a really lovely message from a listener today in our inbox, and it's from an unnamed well-wisher. It's kind of like a secret Santa, but only a month after Christmas.
Yeah. Do you have any idea who it is, Michelle?
No.
Okay, but anyways, the message is really sweet. So whoever sent it, thank you. So they say that I have been following Bound throughout the pandemic and all of your content keeps me going. So please continue to keep up the good work. So thanks thanks everybody for writing in.
So here's a reminder to all of you writers out there about our special offer this year. We came up with our, one-on-one mentorship programs for writers because we know how solitary writing can be, right? Writing prompts, exercises, feedback, and so much fun is in store for all those lucky ones who manage to book their slots before March 1st because we have very limited slots left.
So how do you book? Use the discount code BOUNDMENTEE2022 and get a 10% discount on our 3-month mentorship program. Book your slots for the year before March 1st, 2022. You have lots of feedback, reading, and fun in store.
Yes, don't forget the discount code. It's BOUNDMENTEE2022. So book your slot now. The link is in our show notes. We spoke to Shivani Sibal on this episode, who wrote her debut novel about Delhi and its disparity in class. She shared with us, how challenging it was to really understand her male characters because she grew up in a household full of women.
Yeah, so the book is about two boys who, they're from different classes and they're friends when they're kids, and the dynamic, that happens when they grow up. But what I really liked about the book was its focus on women, actually, even though the main characters were two guys. And she really went into the details of, the trials and tribulations and the emotions of these women in a very honest way that really showed a mirror to society. And I didn't know this, Michelle, but actually her mom and sister are both into publishing. So her mother is Namita Gokhale, who's a legend. She's an evergreen writer. And Meru Gokhale, who is an editor and a name behind so many successful writers. So this gene of, good writing is obviously in her family.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you can make out, through the really refined writing. And that I was especially curious about the character Rajesh, right? So there are these two boys, and especially Rajesh because he was quite different from her, right?
He works as the domestic help, yeah.
Yes. And I think I'm drawn to stories that explore the depths of personalities who are different, like just because of class, because of society. And I recently saw this film Archipelago. Have you seen it?
No, I've never even heard of it. What is it about?
It's actually a family drama, okay? And it's very interesting because this family goes on a holiday and they hire a help for their meals, right? So there's this cook they have hired. And my favorite scenes throughout the movie was just when they showed that cook conversing with, with the hero. Because I love it when they talk about their life, or when they, even just share very small details about their work days. It's really interesting.
No, it kind of makes you think, because we are on the other side, and even like calling them a day, that, there's so many problems around it. But anyways, we're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss Shivani Sibal. Your actually movie recommendation brought to me another one. It's called The Help. I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah,
which also merges the race issue into
I love
this.
it.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack. So we do try and unpack a lot of that with, the person who's explored it. That is Shivani. So definitely, I hope you guys enjoy the episode. And also for anyone who hasn't visited Delhi, this is a perfect opportunity to get a great glimpse into everything that Delhi has to offer, good, bad, and ugly. So let's go.
Yes, let's dive in. So welcome, Shivani.
Welcome, Shivani.
Thank you,
We're
Tara.
very excited.
Happy to be here.
I read your book. Yeah, I firstly, I love the cover of the book.
Thank you.
It just reminds me of like my grandparents are from Delhi, so it reminds me of, like spending afternoons in their house in Delhi. And then I picked up the book and just sort of devoured it. So the first question. Shivani, your book focuses on these class differences between Ahan, who is the heir of this wealthy Sikand family, and Rajesh, who is the house help, and they grow up as friends and then they come apart. And you had mentioned before, in other interviews that you wanted to explore friendship. But, why did you explore class? What is it about exploring these class dynamics that motivates you as a writer?
This central theme of the book, which is two friends separated by class, as you just said, that is power and class is all about the center of the book. When I grew up in Delhi, like kids like me, we went to play outside every evening in the colony, right? And we were unsupervised by adults and just told, when it becomes dark, come back home when the streetlights come on. And it was a very normal thing back then, spontaneous play with whoever's around. And, that doesn't happen now. All friendships of children are curated by their parents, right? And kids would come to the park from, the what are called the kothis, the bungalows, and the quarters alike, the staff quarters. They came from very different backgrounds, played together, and were friends for those 2 hours, right? And that friendship led to empathy and understanding of each other. And, that's where this idea came from of two friends separated by class. Now, why class, I think, was a question which you came up with, right? And, as you know, I'm a debut novelist. And what I took to heart is I didn't know very much about writing. And I had got this great advice from people, write what you know. I think this is one of the classic writing advice given out to people. And, any act of creativity is by its very nature fraught with self-doubt. So I needed confidence on my subject at the very least. So, I had explored these interactions myself and lived them as a young child. And this is kind of the story I wanted to explore. And I think it worked well.
Yes, it absolutely did. And we were actually talking about the title. It's really, really difficult to arrive at a title that is really apt for the book, right? But we thought there was nothing better than equations because especially when I kept reading the book, I imagined this, seesaw between both the boys. And because there's a constant shift in the power roles, right? So what were the other titles that you considered and how did you actually arrive at the final title?
The only title I ever considered was Equations. I knew that this book would be called Equations, and there is a reason behind it. Is the equations between all the characters and their shift is the central theme of the book. That is a crux of what this book is about. So I was very clear on the title and what I wanted pretty early in the process.
And the title really, it's such an apt title because it's all about that power balance. I like what you said about, it's very interesting that you observed what's happening around you and then you wrote this book. And you said that you obviously wrote this book from memory. And I find it very interesting because what you do so well is you take what is around you and translate it. But you also go into characters that obviously you don't know anything about. For example, we actually don't know the inner workings of someone like Rajesh, or even, you being a woman to go into the characters of these two boys. So it was sort of very close as well as sort of very imaginative as well. And I really liked that dynamic for you as an author as well. Since you say you've grown up with women in other interviews and you didn't even have a brother. So how did that play in when you were going into the heads of class through these two boys?
Yes, you're right, Tara. I don't have a brother. And in fact, my father died when I was very young. So I have, grown up surrounded by women. And I have very little insight into the psyche of the male mind. This is all correct. It's to the extent that when I finished writing this, I had to check with friends who are male whether I got the tone accurate of how men think. That's how unsure I was of this. So why did I put myself through this? For the challenge. I was very confident of my subject, which is, Delhi, the class relations, the nuances. I felt very confident of that. So I wanted to push myself on exploring the characters. I wanted to get out of my own comfort zone, because also I think what happens if I'd stayed in that is a lot of things would have been so obvious to me that I wouldn't have bothered pointing them out. So I wanted to think outside my own mind, and that I felt would also give the book a more non-judgmental tone. So that's what I was going for. Yes.
And one of the things that I really liked about the book was that, it really did feel like a mirror. So in that sense, it felt, at least for me personally, growing up the way that I did, it sort of felt like a mirror to society, while at the same time sort of taking you into other dimensions.
Thank you. That's in fact quite what I was going for. So that's very heartening to hear.
Yeah, and adding to the friendship with Shivani, actually I was thinking of other books which cover female friendship, right? So Elena Ferrante has done it really well, and lots of writers are doing that, but we don't often see male friendships in fiction, and I think your book did it really well, which makes me think about your process. So you've mentioned that, you wrote the book 3 years ago, and you hadn't told anyone that you were working on it. My God, I don't know what willpower, and since it's your first work of fiction, I wanted to know what, drove you to complete it without sharing it with anyone, like how did you manage to finish a first draft without any validation?
I was fairly diffident, to be honest, because I didn't know, whether I would even finish it, I'll go as far as saying that. And, the beginning part, which you're talking about, I didn't tell anyone, was the most difficult part, the loneliest part, because, I have all these random passages in my head, and it's like connecting an intellectual jigsaw puzzle with the pieces kind of scattered in my mind. Now, what I've seen is if you tell someone you're writing a book, and, I have the privilege of being close to several writers, in the community. There's this pressure of, oh, how's it going? Now, I don't know the answer to that question at this point, right? I didn't even know whether what I had in my mind would come together as a coherent story. So did it take willpower? No, I was in no hurry to tell anyone, because I was just kind of saving myself the embarrassment if I hadn't finished. So yes, after I finished the first draft, there was a credible beginning, middle, and end. Then I felt, okay, now I can see this to its, to the last mile. So then I shared news with others.
I totally relate to that, because sometimes when you announce something and then you don't follow through, it is very embarrassing. So even I sometimes just try and wait it out, even though I personally die to tell people.
Now, of course, when I write a second book, everybody's like, when is your second book coming?
Right.
I'll have to kind of deal with that a little better this time. And hopefully it'll make me a little less lazy and make me work a little harder. The pressure, right?
Pressure is sometimes good.
Yeah.
But, your book, another thing that I liked about the book was that it was very quiet in tone. It said a lot, but the characters, they were not overly aggressive or violent and things like that. Especially Rajesh, who is the house help, and he's Ahan's childhood friend. He stands out from the other house help because you've really portrayed him as this very sensitive character. And he takes these everyday humiliations to his heart, and versus the other characters who have sort of a thicker skin. So I was very interested in what made you add this trait for him as a driving force for him to, break out of his role and do what he did. He could have been a rebel. He could have been many other things, aggressive, but you chose sensitivity. So why sensitivity?
So, Tara, I started out by the premise that all human beings are similar in their desires, aspirations, personality traits. And there is a tendency for people, such as myself, I'm not at all, suggesting this is a problem of the world that I don't have, to otherize people who are not from our, who we don't necessarily understand as well. And then we go into this sort of thing of not imagining that they have the same range of emotions, thoughts, feelings that we do. And, I started out from this premise that every person has a range of emotions. And what I wanted to pick in Rajesh was sensitivity, that here is a young man who has grown up in a very difficult environment, where on one hand he's a friend, on one hand he's a son of a staff member. And why should that only bring out aggression in him? It can just as well make him reflective and sensitive like it would anybody else. So that is where that came from. Also, I feel on another note, there's a lot of negativity and there's a particular kind of portrayal of class division, which is, like you said, quite aggressive. And I wanted to move away from that because that's not the only dimension that this has.
Yeah. No, true. I mean, that makes us think about, different books or different films that have portrayed that. And one movie that comes to mind, one book that comes to mind is The White Tiger, right? And I really like how you said, we kind of assume that the other person would not feel what we feel, or they have completely different feelings. And that makes me think about representation, like in because we do have a lot of conversation around this nowadays, right? Like, who gets to write what, and are we really allowed to write about a character who's not like us, right? There's a lot of conversation, a lot of debate, and we've been following it very closely. So I wanted to know, so how can one really know the truth? Like how can one really get into a character's head and know what they're thinking? So, for example, Rajesh is quite different from you and different from your own experience. So, what did you do to really understand Rajesh's point of view?
So, this goes back to a question which a number of people have asked me is, how did you come up with this idea, right? And all I can say is, it's ubiquitous. It's all around me. How could I not? There are people around me, and through, my work and my life, I have had the privilege of interacting with very, very different kinds of people. And I wish I had some great answer to how I did. But if you, again, come back to the premise that everybody has the same desires, maybe if, different things or different levels, each person feels the same range of emotions that I do, and I just projected that. To be honest, there's no magic answer here, unfortunately.
It really did make me think, like we can never know, what the other person is thinking. And, I grew up with house help, and they were always sort of considered like family, much like Rajesh was. And it was quite a jarring experience for me to sort of read the book, because it put me in the position of Ahan, where, and I didn't want to think of myself as a character that could, cause somebody who's different from me harm, or, make them feel bad. And it really did make me think, how much do they really think like, did my house help really think like this? Or, what was going on in their head. So that was quite interesting.
Tara, to answer that, how do we know we got it right? I would say in fiction, we mostly don't. We don't know. I mean, this is my take on something. I may be entirely wrong. I can only hope that it resonates with readers. And that's it. I think that if we go into what's right and what's wrong, that's not great for creativity. Because I should agree that I may get entirely wrong. You may think what I've written doesn't resonate, and that's fine too.
Right. No, it's very interesting. And I also wanted to ask, about your use of third person. I find the use of third person interesting because it allows you to sort of go into different of the characters' heads and also be a spectator. So we wanted to know a little bit more about you, the writer, in real life. Are you generally an active participant, or are you the spectator that observes and chronicles society?
So this third person perspective, fly on the wall perspective, I wrote this novel at times of the day when I had some quiet, because I do have young children, and it's kind of difficult to think. And when I did manage to get into the trance-like state it takes me to ideate, I would be in the room with the seconds. They would be talking to each other, and I'm just kind of transcribing. I'm typing. I've written. I don't know who wrote it when I've written it. Does that make any sense? I don't know. But that's what happened, right? Is that you are going deep into the recesses of your own mind, specifically in a book written by memory, and all kinds of synapses and connections are like firing up. So yeah, that is the process. Personally, I mean, I thought I was like, pretty out there. And my friends and family said, we didn't know you're watching us so closely. In fact, now we'll behave better around you, whatever that means. So take away from that what you can, okay?
So how much of your friends and family were in the book?
So, somebody asked me this question yesterday, and I must read out a passage which is right, or a part of the book which is right at the beginning to answer that question. It's right, near the dedication page, and it says, and I quote, "This is a work of fiction, and all characters and incidents described in this book are a product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental." But that apart,
Very smart.
I do have an answer for that. And it's in two parts. The first part is I didn't want to write about anyone I knew, and there were two reasons. First is, it's a bit lazy. You just kind of take the lives of people around you and just sort of put it down. Where's the imagination in that? And the second is it's kind of cruel because, I can only tell you I would not want that done to me. I'm quite sure, okay? And then, the good news is none of my friends and family have broken up with me. They all still like me. Great. The second part of this is that I wanted the characters to counterintuitively be generic because I wanted everyone to identify with them. I wanted, say, a Michelle or a Tara who don't know the people I know to say, well, doesn't this person remind you of so-and-so? And doesn't this person remind you of so-and-so? I felt it would cause the book to resonate, the characters to resonate more.
I'm drawn to poetry since my teens. I like how poets are able to condense, a huge, overwhelming experience into something which can be explained in just a few words. And a collection I read recently has done that very well. Akhila Mohan's collection Tamarind, which is published by Kitab, and I admire the publisher because they always publish good work. And the title Tamarind really stood out to me because I'm especially fond of that spice. I'm often found raiding the tamarind jar. But jokes apart, Akhila has managed to write about life's sour experiences with so much room for the reader. Like, even though they were her experiences, I felt like I was a part of the book, and if I had to pick one poem from the collection, it would be Amma. And the last lines of that poem really haunt me. They are a debt that we can never repay. And my God, like I just, I can't forget those lines. So I think all the poems, they deal with really, really heavy themes, like heartbreak, loss, longing. But the way Akhila has written it would I would say readers would just breeze through the collection and yet the poems would stay with them. So do check out the collection. It's very interesting how you navigate so many things in the book, right? Like we said, third person really gives you I would say that upper hand because you tell us about so many more characters. And what I really liked about it was, though the book is actually focused on two boys, what you managed to do really well is the female characters also in a way are a life of the book, because I was drawn to Parul, who is Ahan's wife, especially because how her financial background differs from her friends, and she's not able to go abroad to study like them, and then it's really difficult for her to fit into Ahan's way of life. I found that really interesting.
So I really liked Ahan's mom, and I don't want to give away too much, but I liked that she becomes this loner because something happened.
Yeah, but we wanted to focus on the female characters, for a bit. So I wanted to know which one was the most challenging to write, and which one was your favorite.
Even the female characters that I've explored are outside of my comfort zone. In that, I've grown up in a very liberal atmosphere and very women dominated. However, the effects of patriarchy, both of you, I'm sure will agree with me, are everywhere. No one is unscathed, right? So, find me a girl or woman in this country who hasn't faced up to some level of the things that you read about in Equations. Having said that, all the female characters were much smoother for me to write. I could, glide in and out of their psyche from that, what I knew of, people in my life, my friends, my teachers at school, things I'd seen around me. Found it much easier to write the women characters. And I needed that for my own confidence because I was already kind of struggling with the male characters, which is literally the main two characters of the book. As for my favorite, it is Sana, the Indian American wife of Rajesh. I feel very protective of her. She's a young girl. She's alone in like a completely new circumstance, and she's just generally alone.
No, that does make sense. And another thing that I really loved is Delhi. So again, it wasn't very sort of abrasive. It was, you painted this whole atmosphere that was very nostalgic. It reminded me of my time as a child in Delhi. There's a lot of Hindi in the book. Those birthday parties, afternoon atmosphere. But I couldn't quite put a finger on what you did to make this atmosphere of Delhi really come across. So how did you do this? How did you incorporate, Delhi into the book?
So, I look at my relationship with Delhi as, with a troubled sibling. We can't ever leave each other. We love each other, but it's a difficult place to live, isn't it? Even for someone with the kind of privilege that I am fortunate enough to enjoy. Um, like I said, this book is written entirely from my own memories of growing up in Delhi, specifically the parts of childhood which you are referring to. And, again, as a debut novelist, I keep going back to that because I think it's important to this conversation. I wasn't confident at all, right? I mean, I wasn't even confident enough to tell anyone I'm writing a book. So if you're not confident of your craft, you have to be confident of your subject. And that's why I felt that I was able to come across in the parts of Delhi with confidence because I possess that confidence. Like, I know that everything I've written about Delhi is accurate. And it's an ode to a city, I can never stop loving despite our problems.
What advice would you give to somebody who wants to portray a sense of place in such a visceral way as you have?
Well, firstly, they must be able to be honest with themselves. That if you sugarcoat or see everything with rose-tinted glasses, your depiction will not be accurate. And the second is more practical, is you must know your subject inside out. If you don't know it yourself, you cannot portray it with confidence.
So it makes me think about, how debut writers struggle with a lot of self-doubt, right? We rely on a lot of feedback, and we do know that you come from a literary family. Your mother, Namita Gokhale, she's also quite a well-known writer, and your sister is also, the editor of a publishing house. So we wanted to know, what was it like, sharing your work with them? Did they give you feedback, and what was it like growing up in a household with literary people?
So I'll start with growing up with literary people. I read one book a day. This is not an exaggeration. Every day I was taken to Midland Bookshop in Aurobindo Market and I could buy a book. And my parents were not this generous of me if I want to buy anything else. But they never stopped me from accessing knowledge, which I'm very grateful for because it has stood me in very good stead through my life, in that I'm just interested in things because of that. As for, you're right that I am surrounded by a very literary and, in fact, an intellectual atmosphere, both on the part of my birth family and my husband's family. My mother is the kind of mother who thinks her daughters can do no wrong. Hey, very good, beta, very good. So I did actually turn to her for any advice because I wanted some genuine advice. Okay. My sister, on the other hand, is a more critical eye because obviously, she is a publisher. She knows, the business of publishing in and out. And she was, in fact, my first reader. And the reason for this is, I knew that she would be honest with me. And the reason was, and she said this to me later, if it wasn't good, I would have told you to save you the humiliation of having it out there. I would have euthanized this book in some way or the other without kind of, you'd rather be embarrassed in front of me than literally the whole world. So, yeah. I did benefit from that in a lot. And, to credit to my mother, she gave me the most important piece of writing advice that I would like to share with anybody who's struggling with finishing or writing. All of us have so many things imposing on our time. And I also feel, this is totally unrelated, but I think smartphones are like messing with our heads and our attention spans. So, we need to write. There is a common wisdom that you must write 500 words a day or 1,000 words a day. And, I was struggling with that. And my mother says, well, why don't you write 200 words a day? Now, that sounds really little, doesn't it? And this is how I finished this novel because I would write 200 words a day. So it took me like 3 years instead of 1.5 years or 1 year or whatever else, the conventional wisdom says. But the point is it got done. It's not a race, but you have to get the job done every day. And you can't carry the 200 words over to the next day, if I'm being really specific here. And, the way this advice worked so well is I had a child in the middle of those 3 years. I had a baby, right? So I had literally an infant in my lap, but I still could put the time aside for that. So yes, I have benefited greatly from the wisdom of those around me in one way or the other.
I totally relate with the bookstore, the reading a book a day thing. That's what I used to do also. And my parents were like, oh, there must be something wrong with her. All she does is sit and read. But anyway, these are the perfect beta readers. But yes, I mean, I can imagine, also the kind of pressure it would be as a debut writer, putting your first baby out into the world, first piece of literature out into the world. So what were your struggles, as a debut writer?
I actually felt no pressure in the first book because I had no expectations of myself. And also, I had gotten very good feedback from all the publishing houses I had approached, right? And I had the sense before the book entered the world that it was not bad. I mean, it was not horrible, at least, okay, that no one would hate it. So that was my starting point. I now feel pressure for my second book because there is an expectation of X from me, which didn't exist in the beginning.
How are you dealing with that pressure now when it comes to writing your second book?
Well, I'll tell you when I get started. I'm in the ideating stage. And the ideating involves me staring out a wall and saying I'm ideating. So that's pretty easy, I suppose. Yeah.
We spoke about the power dynamics in your books, right, Shivani? And one thing that I really, really liked is how you have navigated the power dynamic between a wife and a mistress. So in this case, it is Ahan's mother and Nuria. Why haven't you named Ahan's mother in the book?
And actually, a lot of people have asked me that. I'm happy to hear it because I didn't know whether that's something everybody or anybody would pick up on. Ahan's mother has subsumed her identity as a person to being a wife, a mother, the mistress of Sikand house. And it is that reason that I have not named her, because her own identity is subsumed.
I wanted to know about, how you managed to cover different decades in the book, right? So it also covers the 1980s and until today, right? Because a lot of writers who speak to us tell us, it is kind of a pressure, or it's kind of confusing because, when you pick a certain time period to portray, even though it's not historical fiction, right? You have to be careful about the kind of references you give. You have to be aware of what you're doing, right? So it's a very conscious effort, which kind of, gets in the way of the fun of writing fiction. So what advice would you like to give writers who want to cover several decades but who want to do it well?
Well, Michelle, I studied history and I love history. So for me, it's a pleasure to read about other eras. So the advice I would give is you must enjoy it, or, you won't be able to immerse yourself in it. But specifically to this book, it's parallel to my own lifetime. I'm born in 1980. I'm 41 years old. And when Ahan and Rajesh are a certain age, I was also that certain age. And, now kids are protected from a lot of stuff. But when we were kids, I remember, for example, the death of Indira Gandhi and the 1984 riots. I remember these things very clearly because I don't think our parents filtered us from life in the way at least I try and, protect my own children. So, I had a sense of what it felt like at the time. So I didn't actually need a lot of research. Maybe I was, I don't know, hyper aware as an 8-year-old or something. But this is, if I wrote about, say, the 1950s, I would have a much harder time because I wasn't around. I didn't know what it felt like. I didn't know. I know what it felt like to watch the first color TV or, when we didn't have mobile phones or when we had pen pals. I have, you can read up as much as you want. But unless you can feel it, you can't bring authenticity, which comes from little details that you put into the writing. Like it is the details that make it authentic, which you can only give, like, say, at another session. Somebody said to me, how did you put in this bit about Pudhin Hara when Indian kids travel abroad? Now, that's a detail you can only know. You can't read this up somewhere, right? That all Indian kids travel with.
It's really great because the book is so atmospheric, and now I'm getting a little more of a sense of how you did that sense of place and, even the characters is these tiny details that fit very seamlessly into the book. So it's very interesting to hear.
Yeah, and I like the difference between the parenting styles, like you mentioned, Shivani, because recently I watched the show called The Harper House. And in that they showed like 3 different kinds of parenting, in the present day. And like, for example, there is a couple who adopts the document. Of course, it's a satire, but they adopt a documentary style of parenting where they just document what the child does and they don't interfere at all. Kind of like letting the child discover life on their own. And then there's another couple who's just overly possessive or overly, interfering in their child's life. So I find that really interesting.
Now I want to talk about reading, and this is our reading section because all our listeners want to know about authors' book recommendations, and so do we. So, there are so many interesting books written about Delhi. One of the books that I really loved is Deepti Kapoor's A Bad Character. But I want to know from you, what are some books based in Delhi that you really like?
Okay. So I actually loved City of Jinns by William Dalrymple. I don't know if you've read that.
No.
It's excellent. He came to Delhi as a young man, and he spent a year in Delhi and he wrote this book. It's really well written. It's one of his very early books. Specifically reading about Delhi, I haven't actually read a lot because for me, I've always preferred to read about the unfamiliar, to learn new things, right? And not to say there aren't a lot of great books about Delhi, but maybe they just haven't kind of caught my interest. As much as I used to read as a child, I'm ashamed to say that since the pandemic, I've suffered from very bad reader's block, in that I'm unable to concentrate the way that I could. I mean, it could be that there's so many things, vying for your attention. I mean, what is it called? Doom scrolling. How do you guys feel? Do you feel in the modern time, as in this pandemic era, you're reading like you used to?
Oh, no. Things have changed.
Yeah, we did like a whole episode on reading blog.
Exactly.
Oh, you did?
And just to add to that, like you said, smartphones have really killed our attention span. So, we were talking about that, about how we just want to probably be updated with what's happening, and we keep scrolling, right? Like doom scrolling. And then that really takes away from what we do. But, Shivani, what we've realized is what works for us is, reading smaller pieces, or at least for me, because if you feel like, oh, you have to read a novel, and it does take a lot of time, and I would say a longer stretch of time to read a novel, right? So for us, I think reading short stories works.
I think for me, like, I don't read so much short things, but I think for me, like, rereading things because it's familiar.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
So I'll just like go back and like, I know a book is good. I don't remember all of it. I'll just go back and reread it. That has helped a lot with the reading block.
My book is quite short. There was a reason for this. Is I do feel there's a lot of things vying for our attention. Like I'm saying, to get someone to read a very, very long book by a debut novelist, I felt would be a real uphill task, right? I wanted a book that a person can read in 2 or 3 sittings, because I don't feel like I can demand more time, or I could demand more time from a reader at this point. I wanted it to be a lighter read, and there's a reason. If I told you, I've written this book, Tara, it's about misogyny, patriarchy, marital abuse, domestic abuse, poverty, class difference, you might say, oh, I think I'll read this one a little bit later, right? So then, something has to give, something has to become lighter. So I wanted not to then, make it too long or go too heavy on the language part. And, I'll give you this analogy, which yesterday I was thinking, you're going to a wedding. First, you put on a heavy sari, then you put on some heavy jewelry, then you say, chalo, some red lipstick, then you do your hair in a big hairdo. And then you also carry a fancy handbag and paint your nails red. You're going to look like a caricature, right? So you have to take something away for the whole thing to work. And that's what I was going with the length and the lightness. Because the subjects are actually quite heavy if you look into it.
Yeah, and it was, that dichotomy was interesting, because it did feel like a light book. But at the same time, it was, very complex in its ideas, and it was very sort of immersive. And I personally love that kind of reading. That's something that really appeals to me. So yeah.
And since we're talking about books, like you said, you don't want to sound preachy, or I think, when a writer has an agenda in mind, or a propaganda rather, like Ayn Rand's Fountainhead, a lot of people said, though it's a good book, it's quite obvious that her philosophy is coming through that, right? So there was a hidden agenda, and I think your book consciously avoided that. So, but talking about the most interesting aspect of your book, which is class, right? So my one of my all-time favorite stories is The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini.
Oh, that's a beautiful book.
Yeah, I could, go on and on about it, because obviously, it's about 2 boys. Again, there's a class difference and all of that between them.
I loved, this is this Sunil Gangopadhyay those days. I loved that. I loved a lot of Jhumpa Lahiri's books. And I love a book actually written by my brother-in-law, Patrick French, called India, a Portrait. So I actually enjoy a lot of non-fiction reading. Like one of the excellent books I've read in the last year is Caste by Elizabeth Wilkerson. This is an excellent non-fiction book I read last year, which compares caste in India, America, and Nazi Germany. It's very, very interesting. So for me, a lot of non-fiction reading the last few years has been very fulfilling. And, again, this has to do with attention span, in that I can pick it up and put it down much easier than I can a fiction book, because I feel like the ideas somewhere stay with you. Like I really enjoyed Sapiens. In fact, I just started the graphic novel as well.
Oh, I loved the graphic novel.
Yeah.
I had the best time reading that.
One of the books I'm reading right now, which is really interesting, is A Rude Life by Veer Sanghvi. And again, I read a bit of it, I put it away, I pick it up again. He's had such an interesting life and interactions and stuff. So I'm curiously, I think, more of a non-fiction reader than a fiction reader.
Yeah, but you never know what stays and what, filters in. And I always think that, we're all consuming, at least for me, we're all consuming so much content nowadays, some of it has to come out somehow.
Yeah, true. And you don't know from where, right? You don't know from who has probably what has influenced you, because you see a lot of things. Yeah.
Like I read this book, Caste by Suraj Yengde, I think his name is. A very famous book on caste. And, the experience of being, because a lot of writing in India is obviously higher caste writing, right? So a lot of ideas came to me from that book.
So our last section of this interview is the rapid fire round, where we will ask you questions and you will reply rapidly.
I'll do it. Fine. Yeah.
So I'll go first. One of your character's traits you wished you had?
Rajesh's ability to kind of get ahead despite everything, not be bowed down.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. One biggest difference between the Delhi of the 1980s versus today?
Parking. I mean, you wanted rapid
Good
fire.
One.
That was
good.
Okay. Writing or editing or promoting?
I would say probably editing. Writing, editing, promoting. Oh my God, I don't know. There are three such different things. I don't know what your question is. So writing a really amazing bit and having a day of excellent writing is the most rewarding. But I don't know, I have this analogy of I'm a lifelong gymmer, right? Or working out and writing, which is you have to show up at the gym every day, whether you have a good day or a bad day, for you to have the desired result. Similarly, you have to go through really bad writing days and hope for some very good writing days to get a book finished. This is not very rapid of me, but yeah.
No, that's a great line. I love hearing about writing routines,
Yeah.
So, but where do you write?
In my gym, actually, because I have a small gym in the house. And this is, it's obviously only used for a couple of hours a day, 1 hour by me and 1 hour by my husband. So then I put a desk there because then the room is empty like 20 hours a day, right?
That is one of the most unique writing places I've heard of.
Yeah, exactly.
It's where I'm sitting now. And actually, so, I used to do headstands and it really helped me with my writing. So there is a great connect. They say that sitting is the worst position to think, whoever they are. That I always get my best thoughts while I'm walking or running or I feel it's very invigorating.
I completely agree. I always say that after yoga, my mind is clear and I can actually work. So totally.
Yeah. I think cardio helps for me. Dance is something that really, gets me out of this whole sitting zone.
3 of your all-time favorite fiction books.
So I have named 2, which is A House for Mr. Biswas and Those Days. And I would say the third is Paru by Namita Gokhale, my mother's first book. I think it's a fantastic book.
So I actually do this class called Read Like a Writer. Right. And I use Paro for that class.
Oh, do you?
I love that book. Yeah, I do. Well, I love that book. So.
And when she wrote it in 1984 as a 26-year-old, I can tell you it was another ball game altogether.
Yeah, I can imagine. So thank you so much, Shivani, for this conversation and for your insights. It was really interesting getting to know the person behind these characters that really, stayed with me for a very long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tara and Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure. Tara, I think Indian fiction needs more stories about class, right? This conversation actually reminded me about Diksha Basu, right? Whom we interviewed in season 2, because her work also slices through Delhi and its society, but just see how different it is from the way Shivani has done it, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different angles, Diksha's book was so interesting because it's sort of a social satire, whereas Shivani's book is very much a mirror and every writer has their own way of contributing. And that's what's so great about what we do, because there's no dearth of ideas, there's no dearth of techniques. You can have a million writers, each writing a million great books.
All you writers out there who are feeling lost, don't worry. We are here with our special offer on our mentorship program. So book your slot for the year before March 1st. Use the discount code BOUNDMENTEE2022 to get a 10% discount on our 3-month mentorship program. The link is in our show note.
I'm very excited actually for our next episode because it covers a very topic that is a book that is very dear to me. I've actually edited this book. We're speaking to Tanushree Podar, the author of Women in Green, and we're going to see how women in India navigate a very male-dominated space, that is the army. It is beyond fascinating.
Yeah, I can't wait to find out really, like, especially because it's an episode where you really, talk to her and you get into the nitty-gritties of editing. I am really excited about it.
So, as usual, we're editors, podcasters, storytellers. You guys know it. And through Bound, we help you create stories and put them out into the world. We love the world of words.
So thanks so much for tuning in to Books and Beyond with us. We'll be back next Wednesday with Tanushree Podar.